Okay, so the fairing compound has dried. I went back through and I've sanded it all down to get all the high spots and the low spots exposed. The parts that were really low were actually pretty minimal, so I was actually pretty happy with that. So I have now just went back through and added some more fairing compound to the really low spots. And then we'll go back through and we'll sand again, and hopefully it'll be ready for primer at that part. So this is a bit different than the bottom. This is going to be a 2, maybe 3 stage fairing process, whereas the underside was a like, oh man, I don't know how many coats of fairing compound I added to it, but this is a lot simpler. We're not dealing with extreme compound curves in this one. We're dealing with just one gentle slope from one side to the other. So pretty simple to sand, pretty easy to sand, but yeah. So here, let's take a closer look. So yeah, as you can see the high spots and the low spots. It's this language I was speaking of earlier. This is obviously low, and this is high. That's high, this is low. And these are just super, super tiny tolerances. I mean, we're talking like a 32nd or a 64th of an inch. Yeah, so you can see the kind of, what is it called? Camouflage effect going on here. Whereas before, it looked relatively smooth, but then all of this like micro stuff kind of pops forward. And again, I'm not going for absolute perfection here. If I was, I probably would have gone over the entire thing again with fairing compound and then sanded all that again, just to make sure there were no imperfections at all. But there's going to be a lot going on here, so this is not really going to be seen a lot, as I've said previously. So I'm going for a relative, I think we call that 10 feet perfection. If you stand 10 feet away, it looks perfect. Maybe we're shooting for 5 feet or 4 feet, but again, it's gonna be perfect for our purposes. So yeah, so you can see kind of where the low spots were. They were exactly where I imagined them to be, in those 2 corners where the edges were sunk down. And those 2, it's actually really symmetrical. I didn't notice that. In the 2 hatch parts, I knew that was going to happen. That was just a really semi-low spot. And then this, if you can see it, you can see that there's that shadow of a scratch mark in there. That is something you really want to avoid when you're doing fairing compound, is with your spatula. You don't want to dig the end of the spatula into your runs, which is really difficult when you're doing a really wide area. I don't know if it was recorded before or in the time lapse. When you're doing it, you're doing big, broad strokes across the bow. And when you're doing that, there's a distinct start and stop to each of the strokes. And it's really difficult to, at least in my experience, to not have that. Because when you're doing it, you're pulling it towards you, and they just overlap, and sometimes it can dig into it. On the bow, I did a really good job at not having any of those, so you can't see where the start and the stop points were, which is perfect. And I believe that was the only big scratch in it, which I'm very happy with, because on the underside of the boat, there was a lot of learning about how to do that. So yeah, this is going to cure and dry. Tomorrow it'll be ready for sanding. And yeah, after this gets done, if I'm happy with it, then it's on to priming. Well, I say that. The rest of the boat needs to be sanded. So there's a lot of cleanup work to be done around this centerboard console. I've been adding some fillets, zoom in there. I've been adding some fillets with this goo putty that I've been using, and I think this is the 3rd round I've been filling in. So those are coming in up there, Again, using the same goo putty, try and keep it steady. Using the same goo putty to kind of establish that battery console, to establish those 2 posts at the bottom. It's just trimming up work at this point. You can see some resin drips that need to be sanded out, resin drips. So yeah, when you're doing that, when you're doing fiberglass and resin, it's such a crazy process, because the resin is curing in your hands. And actually, here, I'll show you my pride and joy. When I was fiberglassing these decks, I couldn't get the fiberglass cloth to lay down, and I had an entire thing of resin ready to go so I could saturate that cloth and get it down, but it just was wrinkling and I was having issues with it. And this is what happens. So this got, the exotherm is around 300 degrees or something like that, I believe is what the jug says. So that plastic cup was 300 degrees. And when I grabbed that, I let that go pretty quick, and that was solidified. And I don't know, 5 minutes. I mean, it was very, very soon that kicked over. But yeah, so a lot of sanding needs to be done. While that's curing, that's probably what I'm going to do right now, is jump in and start sanding these drips out. You can see I have cardboard laid in here to try and protect it. You learn, every step you do, you learn. So I'm going to trim up that stuff, make sure that's all nice and pretty. And then I think we'll be ready for priming, and then woodwork, and then paint, and then installation, and then hopefully we'll be on the water. So we are, jokingly, we are coming to the end of this project, but we are much farther ahead than we used to be. So yeah. Okay, so we are in the boat getting it ready for primer. We are at the stage where the decks are pretty much done. They've got fairing compound on them, have been sanded off, done a few layers of that. I'm getting the holes and everything cut and trimmed for the electrical and the lighting that's going to run along the main gunnels, the inner gunnels here. But mostly just the big stuff that needs to get done is just a lot of sanding, a lot of sanding, because we've gotten to the stage now where I've put everything on, and now it just needs to be faired and kind of massaged back into where it needs to be. And so all the resin is in place, all the fiberglass is in place. You know, there's a few spots that need a bit more fairing compound. But we're at the stage now where it's basically taking some pretty aggressive sandpaper and going through the entire inside of the hull, the centerboard console, and the entire floor to make sure all the resin drips and all the fiberglass bits are sanded down and smooth so that when you prime, it's ready to go. And that's just making sure all the details, right, where this bulkhead meets the boat and rounds into this nice fillet in this corner, to make sure that's nice and smooth, and you don't have any irregularities in the surface. To make sure this, and this has been a fun time, to make sure this is nice and smooth and sanded down. Like we talked about previously, the inside of the boat is going to be a fiberglass mat material, and it's going to meet this fiberglass cloth material on the top. And so this, I'm trying to sand a lot of the fiberglass matte texture down on the front so it kind of fares through and it doesn't look so abrupt where that material change happens. But not only that, when you put resin on, it doesn't flow evenly, especially when you're putting it on a vertical or semi-vertical surface. So going through and knocking down the high spots and fixing the low spots and just bringing down everything to a reasonably the same texture and the same finish before priming. So yeah, it's just been very tedious is a word, but it's also, you know, this is the finish work. This is what it's all about. This is the part of the boat that you will be interacting with directly. And so it's the thing that you want to spend some time doing correctly. You know, this where you grab this, there's going to be a piece of wood and some lighting, but when you grab it, your fingers are going to be touching the underside of this gunnel. So that wants to be smooth. That wants to be sanded down and make sure that's smooth and a nice area to touch, so you're not, you know, there's not any sharp bits or there's no resin or fiberglass or anything that's, you know, being a bit unfortunate for your fingers when it grabs that. So yeah, it's a lot of work and it's tedious and it's dusty, but it's the important stuff and it needs to be done. So that's what we're doing. So let's get to it.